Hi everyone. I want to continue looking at the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense. So I'm intending to play it as white, and I'm going to go through three different Grandmaster games that were all featured in the book starting out the Sicilian. So I first talked about the Najdorf in a recent video, and I'll put a link to that video in the description below. So let's dive right into the game. Relange versus Sadler from 1997. So they played a Sicilian, an open Sicilian, and here the move A6 is the Najdorf. Okay, the move that I want to play that's considered the most aggressive is bishop to G5, developing the bishop to an aggressive post, pressuring the knight on F6, getting ready to move the queen off of D1 and castling queenside. And the best move here is probably E6. That's the most common in the database. It's supposedly better than the move E5, which you see in other lines of the Najdorf, because with this knight pinned right here, creating that hole on D5 is just not very good for black. So E6, F4 gaining space, and now there's a threat in the position. White can play E5 and attack the pinned knight and possibly win a piece after an exchange of pawns. A pawn comes to E5, and black needs to do something about this. Well, there are two very common moves here. One is to break the pin with bishop to E7. That's what we'll look at in this game. And the other one is to break the pin with queen to B6, hitting the B2 pawn, the so-called poison pawn variation. And we'll look at a game in the poison pawn later. So here, Sadler plays bishop E7, and now queen F3, putting the queen on an excellent square, supporting the pawns there, and getting ready to castle queenside. Black usually starts his normal queenside development before castling kingside. He plays queen to C7, long castles, knight B D7, G4, expanding the pawns on the kingside, getting ready for a kingside attack. B5, and now the bishop takes on F6 in order to release this G pawn to move forward. Black recaptures with the knight, and then G5. Okay, knight goes back to D7, and now the most common move in the position here is this paradoxical looking move F5. Removing the defender of G5, allowing the bishop to take with check. Now white's reasoning is that he's going to break open the position on the king side, and removing this pawn from the position is going to give him more lines of attack. So he can even afford a tempo moving the king out of check in order to do this. And black does take on G5 with check, king B1, and now knight E5 attacking the queen. The queen goes to H5 and puts a lot of pressure on the black position. It's attacking the undefended bishop, but it's also pinning the F7 pawn. So white has two attackers here on E6, and black essentially has only one defender. All right, well, black has to defend his bishop, or move it, and he plays queen to D8 to defend the bishop. So this allows white to capture on E6 since the F7 pawn is pinned. And he does it in the most forcing way. He plays knight takes E6, attacking the black queen. That's a forcing move. Black needs to address that. I think that's better than F takes E6 because that allows the Zwischenzug G6 attacking the white queen. So this move isn't as forcing. All right, so he takes with the knight, bishop captures, and he takes back with the pawn. So the pawn is pinned, and black just castles. Looks like it's dangerous to castle here with all these open files. The F and G files are open to the king, but he does have enough pieces around. He can hang on in this position. So it's a fine move. Rook G1 attacks the bishop for a second time. It falls back to F6, which protects the G7 square. And now white takes on F7 with a check. Black just decides to move the king in the corner instead of taking. For example, if he takes with the rook, he might have to face bishop to H3 with the bishop coming to E6, pinning the rook to the king. And black is not in any hurry to capture on f7. He should be able to capture that at any time when it's favorable. Okay, knight to d5, excellent move, centralizing the knight, bringing another knight closer, another piece closer to black's king. Okay, g6, harassing the queen, and it falls back to h3, keeping an eye down the h file here. For example, in some cases there might be some pressure on this pawn on g6 since the h pawn is pinned by the queen. Okay, now black takes the f7 pawn, and white plays knight to f4, putting more pressure on that pawn. So he has two attackers now on the g6 pawn, and since the pawn on h7 is pinned, black has only that one defender. So white is threatening to take on g6. So black addresses this by playing queen to d7, attacking white's queen, offering the trade of queens, and white has a decision to make here. He can either trade queens or maybe move it out of the way, or allow black to take on h3 since he does have the bishop and knight protecting the queen. White ends up playing queen to b3, but wait a minute, we just mentioned that this pawn was under attack, so what happens if white decides to take it? Well, that's a blunder because black takes the knight, and if white doesn't want to lose a piece, he has to take back. But then black takes the queens off the board and then takes the rook, since there's no more queen pinning the pawn. So black's just a rook ahead in that position. Okay, so after queen d7, white can no longer take on g6. So white decides to move the queen out of the way. The authors of the book I'm reading, or the author John Ems, who's analyzing, suggests white should have traded queens and gone into this endgame right here, and says it's about equal. The engine actually gives us a negative 1.0, so it does favor black here, and I can kind of see why. Material is equal, but I would say that black's bishop here is better than white's because white's bishop is blocked by his e4 pawn. It's on the same color as his e4 pawn. That limits the mobility of his bishop in some cases. Also, black can easily double rooks here on the f file and take control of the f file. Both of these minor pieces have great outposts in the center of the board, but I think the difference is seen in the bishops and the rooks. Okay, so that was a possible way to play, but instead white plays queen to b3, just getting the queen out of the way so the queens won't be traded. And now black plays queen to c6, attacking the e4 pawn. Okay, but white ignores that and plays bishop to h3, maybe trying to sink the bishop on the square. And the reason he ignores it is because the e4 pawn is actually defended tactically. Black can't take it because of the move bishop to g2, skewering the rook. Now, black can get the knight, so maybe it's even stronger to do a desperado, like knight takes g6 check first, and then after recapturing one way or the other, then skewering and winning the rook, so you get that pawn. So it's good to think about those kind of things. So he doesn't defend e4, he plays bishop h3, and then black responds with bishop to g7, releasing an attack on the knight here down the f file. So rook gf1 protects the knight, and black doubles up rooks. And now knight to e6, attacking the rook on f8. And the rook on f1 is defended twice, so white is okay here. Black trades a pair of rooks, and then moves his rook down to f2. So he saves his rook that was under attack, and now he has pressure on c2, keeping this queen here to defend that point in white's position. So it looks like black is doing pretty well, but the engine says this is about equal. Okay, now a4 was played here to try to get some counterplay and break up these two pawns here, and to get a little lift for the king. And then black actually surprised white here by capturing on a4. That's the 28th move of the game, and it's actually the first move that differs from previous play. It's a novelty on move 28. The same player, Matthew Sadler, played this exact position as black before, just a few months before this game. And last time Sadler had this position, he played the move b4 instead, and he got a passive position and ended up losing. Engine says that's about equal as well, playing b4, but he ended up losing. Now, the white player here, Relange, or however you pronounce his name, probably saw this game of Sadler's, and that's why he was playing into this, and he probably analyzed it and wanted to play the same position after b4. But instead, Sadler finds an improvement. He plays b takes a4, and I think white was aware of that possibility and thought he was winning this position. It might look a little suicidal here to open up the b file and allow queen to b8 check. Let's see what happens. Okay, the king can't move, so one of black's pieces has to block on f8, and he doesn't want to do it with the rook and lose the exchange and relieve the pressure on c2. The only move here is with the bishop. But after the bishop to f8, it gets taken, and then queen takes c2 check, and king goes to a2. And this pawn is defended, so white is okay here. Okay, or so it seems. Let's see what happens. Okay, knight to c6, attacking the queen, which was threatening a discovered check. But that looks kind of like a crazy move. That's actually brilliant preparation by Sadler. I believe that was a prepared move. It's crazy to think that you can have a prepared move on move 31 of a chess game. But I believe that was prepared according to John Ems in this book. And it looks crazy because it's allowing white a double check. He can't just do any old discovered check with this knight because his queen will get taken. But he can play knight takes g6 because that's a double check, forcing the black king to move to g7. And then the queen gets out of danger with a check. Queen to b7 check. So what does black play here? Well, he doesn't take the knight. He plays rook blocks, attacking the queen. If he had taken the knight, he would have actually been in a lot of trouble after rook takes d6 check. And then we've got some pieces here that can all attack the black king. Engine says it's actually about equal. It's a plus 0.4 for white, so apparently there's no mate in the position. But that does look dangerous for black to play that way. But instead, black had prepared the move rook to f7, attacking the white queen. Okay, and then queen goes to b6 to save itself. And what does black do in this position? Notice the white rook on d1 is hanging. The white knight is hanging here now. What does black do? Well, black makes one more move and white resigns. If you want to try to find it, go ahead and pause the video. What's black's move that caused white to resign? Okay, well, it wasn't taking the knight and it wasn't taking the rook. It was the brilliant a5. Crazy, just a little pawn move, little tiny pawn move. How does that force white to resign? What's the threat in this little pawn move that's blocked by another pawn? It looks crazy until you realize, well, you just created a square for your knight to land on b4. That's what that pawn is doing there, to protect the knight coming to b4 with check. Turns out there's nothing white can do here. For example, suppose now white decides, okay, I've got to save my rook, otherwise there's going to be a knight coming to b4 check, and the king's going to go back to a1, and then the rook's going to get taken with check or checkmate. So let's look at a couple places that rook could move, like maybe b1. Then knight would come with check, forcing the king to a1. It can't go to a3 because queen to b3 would be mate. You could take the knight with the queen, but you might as well just resign if you're going to do that. So king goes to a1, and now black has a nice mate in 2. Okay, if you want to try to find that, pause the video. Okay, mate in 2 is queen takes rook check, forcing king takes back, and then rook takes f1 mate. Okay, that's the nice mate. So rook to b1 doesn't work. What about rook to e1, sliding it over that way? Well, the knight still comes down with check, and again, the king has to go down to a1. And then queen to d2, nice move, attacking the rook, also releasing a square potentially here for the knight. For example, now let's say the rook goes over to b1 to save itself. Then the winning sequence is a3, bringing the pawn into the action, maybe threatening to capture on b2 with check. Okay, bishop to c4, attacking the rook, maybe protecting the a2 square. This is the best way to prolong things according to the engine, but there's a mate in the position, starting with a takes b2 check, rook takes b2, queen to c1 check, rook has to block, queen goes to a3 with check, bishop has to block, and then takes bishop with mate. So there really was no way out of it after that really cool move in this position, a5. Okay, so maybe the entire game, 34 moves, was preparation by Matthew Sadler. That must be satisfying. Okay, let's look at another game. This is Lobron. Lobron spelled L-O-B-R-O-N, not L-E-B-R-O-N. Lobron versus Chandler, 1986. Okay, so Sicilian, open Sicilian, and a6 is the Najdorf. So we're again going to look at this move bishop to g5 that I would like to play, and the common follow-up e6. So we're going to expand our pawn to f4 here, and we'll look at another game with bishop to e7, breaking the pin and addressing the e5 threat. Okay, so our queen will go to f3, queen to c7, castles, just like the last game, the knight develops, g4, b5, and now the bishop takes on f6. Remember, that's releasing the pawn to come forward. Knight takes f6, the pawn comes forward, knight goes back, and the same move as the last game, f5, allowing this bishop to take with check in order to open up lines. But we're going to look at a different response this time. So in this game, white plays knight to c5. Black plays knight to c5. He does not take the pawn. He tries to keep the king side as closed as possible. He doesn't want to open lines and suffer a lot of tactics. Okay, but white presses forward with the attack. He plays f6. Okay, now there are two ways you can capture here. You can capture with the bishop and then lose your bishop, or better yet, you capture with the pawn. Okay, but then that allows g takes f6, harassing the bishop, and it really has to go back to f8. It's no good on d8 in this position. It really needs to defend that king side. Then rook to g1 grabs the only open file on the board. Okay, bishop to d7 to prepare queenside castling to kind of get out of the danger on the king side. But then white comes up with a brilliant move here. Rook g7. Look at this move. Mr. Anderson, if you're watching this, you probably aren't, then this game is dedicated to you, because that looks like a Mr. Anderson move to me. Rook to g7. Okay, anyway, why does white play that? Well, it puts pressure on f7, so it kind of keeps black from castling long right now. It does allow a capture, and that's what black does. It doesn't seem to be best according to the engine, but either way, white has a strong advantage. The engine says white is up plus 1.7 here. Black does take the exchange, but look at that passed pawn on g7. That's going to become a very powerful pawn in the position. White takes a moment out to play e5. Look at that. That opens a threat here on the a8 rook. So black has to do something about that. He plays d5 to block the threat. The engine says, I think, castling long. Maybe no, the engine doesn't say that, but John Ems, the author of the book, says that was a better try. But it still doesn't look that good after taking the pawn, moving the queen, and then maybe keeping the queens on the board with queen to g3. The engine says this is about +3. White is still attacking. The bishop is coming to g2 next. maybe b4 dislodging the knight, maybe the knight's coming to e4 and f6, and this queen is protecting that passed g-pawn. White is looking really good, so maybe castling long wasn't much of a better option either than what happened in the game. Oops, back up, d5 happened in the game here, and then queen f6, so finally protecting that g7 pawn. Okay, b4, maybe black wanted to get that in before white did. And now white moves the knight to f5. Brilliant move. Let me go back, though, and look at another option. Besides for b4, John Ems said perhaps queen to d8 was worth looking at, just challenging the queen right there. But it doesn't work out so well either. That allows white to play b4, and then knight to a4, takes, bishop to d3, heading right for that square. Look, that's just unstoppable. What is black going to do? And if he takes the queens off the board, then this pawn is protecting that pawn, and still you can't stop the threat of bishop takes h7. So white is winning in that position. So back to the game, after queen f6, black himself plays b4. And now white comes up with a brilliant sacrifice. His knight is hanging on c3, so what does he do? Well, he puts the other knight where it's hanging by a pawn. So he says, okay, take both of my knights with my pawns, with your pawns there. What's the threat? Why did he play knight to f5? Well, there's a checkmate in one threat now. The knight is allowing the queen to go to e7 with mate. So black has no option other than to take the knight on f5. And why did white do that? Well, because he wanted to move his c3 knight, but he wanted to move it to d5. So he removed the defender of the d5 square. And that attacks the queen, and it again threatens the mate on e7. So that forces the queen back to d8 to protect against the mate. But then queen to d6, brilliant move, cutting the black king off and threatening knight to f6, which would force queen takes knight is the only move to avoid that mate. All right, so what should black do here? Well, black played f6 to gain an escape square for the king, but he's doomed no matter what he does. Let's look at another possibility. Maybe knight to e4 is a try because that protects against knight to f6. But after knight e4, white can play it anyway. Knight f6 check, and then knight takes f6 allows e takes f6, and look at the e file, wide open. Rook to e1 is threatened here. What can black do? Nothing. Maybe he plays rook to a7 with the idea of getting the rook in to block on e7, but rook e1 check forces the bishop to block. We just take the bishop, forcing the recapture with the pawn, and then take with the queen, and then two ways to block this check. If you block with the queen, then we get a queen for a pawn. So you don't want to do that, so you block with the rook, but then the pawn pushes forward for a mate. So there really is nothing to do here for black. Knight to e4 just doesn't work. So he tries f6, but then bishop to c4 is pointed at that square that black just opened up for himself. He just opened an escape square for his king to prepare against knight takes f6, and white just closed the escape square down. Not to mention the bishop is pointed right at the rook. So what does black do here? Well, he tries bishop to e6 to oppose that bishop to preserve that escape square. But then the knight's going to c7 here with check. Okay, and that forces the king over to f7. And now the move that forced black to resign, bishop takes e6 check. So black resigns here. What can he do? He can't take the bishop with the knight. You're just going to get a check like this and reveal an attack on the queen. Not to mention, is this check? No, there's no checkmate yet. But then you can take the queen, and if you take the rook back, then you could take back like this. But now it's a disaster for black any way you look at it. Okay, so you can't take the bishop with the knight. What are you going to do? Well, you have to take the pawn with the king. But then queen takes knight, protecting your knight, releasing an attack on the queen, and rook's coming to the g file, the king's in trouble. What can black do? Well, save the queen, bring the queen over to f8 maybe, Rook to g1 check, forces the king up. What happens if it goes back to here? Well, you lose the queen. You have to take now and lose the queen. And it's actually a mate in 8, so you can't go back there. After rook g1 check, king comes up. Then queen to e3 check, and rook blocks, but you just attack the pinned piece with the pawn, and everything's hanging. The rook's hanging, the other rook's hanging, the king's hanging. There's actually a mate in 9 in the position. So the resignation was correct. All right, let's look at one last game. This one is Timman versus, I'll mispronounce this, Ljubojevic or Ljubojevic. I think it's Ljubojevic. So 1985, Jan Timman has the white pieces, a famous Jan Timman. Okay, and this is another Najdorf. So right here, a6, bishop g5, e6, f4. Now a new move, queen to b6. So last time we looked at bishop e7. So this is the poison pawn variation. And I want to look at more games in the poison pawn because this game is exciting and explosive. The tactics are just crazy. Let's see what happens. So white generally allows black to take the b2 pawn, and he plays queen to d2 to protect the knight on c3. Black takes the pawn, rook goes to b1, forcing the queen to a3. It's the only move. Okay, so look at the position. White gave up a pawn, but he has this half-open file for his rook. He has all these pieces developed. Black still needs to get the bishop developed and get castled, and black has much less development. White has more space thanks to this pawn duo here, so white has a lot of compensation for his pawn. Apparently he has about 1 point worth of compensation because the engine tells me this position is 0.0. Okay, sometimes the engine evaluations just don't really matter. But anyway, it says 0.0. So how does this game go? Well, there's a lot of moves white can make here. You can play f5, you can play e5, you can play bishop takes f6, or you can just play a developing move like bishop e2, like Jan Timman played, getting ready to castle. Okay, and then black plays bishop to e7, and white castles, and black plays knight b d7. And now white has to do something. John Ems, the author of the book, is telling me that when you sacrifice a pawn like this, you cannot let your opponent catch up in development. If you just let black castle here and play b5 and bishop b7 and just get developed and you don't do anything about it, then you're just down a pawn. You cannot let black catch up in development. So what white does is he tries to just pry open the position. He plays very aggressively here and never gives black even a chance to castle. Looks kind of, I'm skeptical. Are you skeptical about that? Can you keep black from castling here? Isn't he just 1 move away from castling? Well, white begins with a threat, e5, threatening the knight on f6. Black has nothing better than to take, and then white takes back, threatening the knight again. Black has nothing better than to take. So white gave up another pawn. So now he's 2 pawns down in the position, but he's opened up some lines here. Now look, he's got no pawns in the way anymore. He's got a lot of open lines. And he plays another forcing move. Bishop takes f6, so black has to respond to that. He has to take back. Now he takes back with the bishop, which apparently is a mistake. The theory is you're supposed to take back with the pawn, but you can get a crazy position after that. For example, white can play knight to e4, attacking the f6 square. And by the way, look at the clear third rank here. At any time, this rook can lift to b3, gaining in tempo on the queen and transfer itself along this third rank. Okay, so after knight e4, threatening f6, the f6 pawn, the natural response, according to theory, is f5. But then we get in this move, rook to b3 with tempo. Queen goes to a4. Okay, knight takes pawn. Look at that move. Why knight takes pawn? Well, you're breaking open the position, but you're also opening up the d file here for your queen, and you're allowing this knight to come in to d6. So knight takes pawn, e takes f5, knight to d6 check, forcing bishop takes, queen takes, and we'll stop the position here and just mention, look at the black king. It's trapped in the center of the board. Yes, white has sacrificed a piece, but there's a raging attack going on here, and I would rather be white. The engine says this is negative 0.5, so the engine says black is better by half a pawn. But I would rather, that would be more fun to play this as white, actually. But anyway, that's one possible line after recapturing here with the pawn, which apparently is much better. But black here captures with the bishop. So let's see what happens if that natural move is made. White should be ready for that. That seems very natural. Well, what does white do to keep the initiative going, to keep black from castling? What's the only move here? There's only one move you should be considering in this position as white. You already gave up 2 pawns. You're trying to break open the position, so you sack the exchange. You take the bishop on f6. G takes f6. Knight to e4, coming to the center of the board, hitting the f6 square. What should black do to defend that square? Well, not what he did. He plays the passive move knight to d7, retreating the knight. Now the knight has only one function there, which is to protect f6. It's blocking in that diagonal that the bishop was enjoying. Instead, I think black had to play the queen back to e7 to defend that pawn. This queen is going to be a much better defender of the king. It needs to get back into a defensive stance. But he plays the knight back to d7, and that allows rook to b3. That's that move with tempo we saw. And black plays queen takes a2, which looks kind of silly to me. But you may wonder, what if he goes back to e7 now in a defensive position? Well, now it's too late. Here's what would happen. Knight to c6. Look at that move. Knight to c6. Why is he putting the knight right where it can be taken? Well, you remember this from earlier. He's clearing the d file so the queen can influence down the d file, allowing this knight to come to d6, and he's doing it with tempo by attacking the black queen. Black is nothing better than to take the knight and allow the knight to come into d6 with check. Now there's 2 ways the king can run. Let's look at both. Let's start with king to f8. Well, that allows a mate in 2. Queen to h6 check, king moves over, rook mates. Okay, so let's look at the other way. What if the king goes to d8? Well, that's no better. You've got queen to a5. Well, it's a little better, but you're still going to lose. Queen to a5 check, and that forces the knight to block. And then you can take that, and the king comes up. And then you don't have a quick mate here, but you can still attack with the move knight to e4, saving your knight, opening up the d file here for the rook. And black is just suffering, and the engine says it's about +3 for white. But the game continues, so that's the way to move the king. All right, so that's why queen to e7 doesn't work in this position, and that explains why maybe black played queen takes a2, which is about as good as anything. But then knight to d6 check, king to f8, queen to c3. Now that's a great move because, for one thing, the queen can transfer itself over to the king side, like that. For another thing, it's putting pressure down this diagonal. And for another thing, that's an immediate threat to win that bishop on c8. Okay, so that's a good move. And then king to g7. I don't know, trying to run here and protect the bishop again with the rook, I guess. But that allows the knight to sack itself. Either knight can go to f5 there because the other knight's coming to take its place. And then king to g6. King to f8 doesn't work because that allows queen to b4 check. And there's going to be a mate soon. Like if king goes to e8, there's queen there mate. If king goes over here, there's a rook over here mate. The knight can delay things for a move, but that's a mate. So king went to g6 instead, and then white found a very nice move here that caused black to resign. So maybe you want to predict white's move. Pause the video. Okay, white played queen to h3. That threatens two mates. That's very nice. That defends the knight here, notice, and it threatens rook to g3 mate. But it also threatens queen to h5 mate, and black just can't stop them both. There's nothing he can do. He can delay the mate. He can play things like, I don't know, something stupid like queen a1 check, but king can go to f2, and there's just no more checks. I guess you can come here and draw the knight away, but it's useless. It's a mate in 7 in the position. So black resigned. Okay, so I am learning a lot from these Najdorf games in this excellent book by John Ems. Hope you learned something too. Thanks for watching.